Hello again. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. It's Mitchell Warren from AVAC and delighted to welcome so many of you on the line. We are just about to get started. If you hold for one more minute, just to let you know, people are in muted mode as we are recording this to keep a clean line, and we have a lot of people from all over the world, and we're delighted for that. And we are going to get started in just a minute. And all right, it looks like Helen is planning to join, but maybe a few minutes late. But I think in the interest of time, maybe we'll go ahead and get started, and hopefully she will join as we go. Let me just see one thing technically. All right, apologies again. We're all grappling with new ways of doing most everything. But I am enormously grateful for so many people to be on the line right now in what continue to be extraordinary and challenging times for one and all. So we are particularly pleased that so many of you can do this. I just did get one sec. Levi, if you could send to Susie and Helen both the right link for them, because they're having a hard time getting on.
Yeah, happy to do that.
That would be great. So sorry, everybody. And let me do this. All right. Technical difficulty aside. Delighted to welcome everyone here to this webinar looking at pandemic vaccine development, somewhat historically, as well as most importantly, lessons for COVID-19. We're also going to have a chance to look at some of the therapeutic research, knowing that Helen Reese is going to be joining us hopefully very shortly from South Africa as well. And we now have several hundred of you on the line, and want to just talk a little about the logistics, that there are the line is muted for all. We are really, though, looking for questions and conversation. If you're on the Zoom feature, you can easily type in questions or in the Q&A piece at the bottom of your screen, or the chat feature, and we'll be consolidating those. We also got a lot of questions in advance of the call that we'll be going through. You can also email avac@avac.org if you're having trouble with the Zoom feature. I know already there was a question. We did have a webinar just last week with Carl Diefenbach from the NIH, Yvette Raphael from APA in South Africa, and Lillian Mareko from ICW East Africa. A recording of that call, which looked also at the HIV, COVID interactions and information that was accurate at that time, is online, and that link is available at the AVAC website, as will the recording of this call. And we're really grateful to have everyone here. I do want to say, just before we kick off, and delighted that Mark Feinberg, a dear friend and colleague who leads the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative, now IAVI, to further connect the dots between what we all do in HIV research and development with coronavirus. And I think for all of us on the line, whether you knew her or not, the link between HIV research and coronavirus became realer than any of us might have imagined, and certainly realer than any of us ever hoped it would be, in the very tragic news earlier this week that Geeta Ramsay passed away. Geeta was a dear friend and colleague to so many of us on this call, and any of us working in HIV prevention research. And to lose a leading light in this field, an inspiring colleague and friend to so many of us, is always hard. And to know that it happened in the midst of and because of the coronavirus really brings home the importance of our collective work, whether we work in one epidemic or many. We have to keep her approach, I think that she taught us all that in the face of often disappointing research results, you had to get back and do more. And that was certainly the lesson I think any of us who knew her in the microbicide and larger HIV prevention field knew over decades of her leadership. And just wanted to acknowledge that at the top of this call, and maybe take just a moment before we move into the content together. All right. Again, apologies for having to start that way, but I can't imagine not. But we did really want to bridge from what has happened for now almost 40 years in HIV research, and particularly then in other pandemic vaccine developments, to look at what the state of the science and the art is in the current environment. And we couldn't think of anyone better to have that conversation than Mark Feinberg. For the last several years, he's led IAVI and in doing remarkable work both in HIV vaccine development as well as in other areas of vaccine development. But as many of you may know, before that, he had a long career at Merck, a leading pharmaceutical company, and worked on a number of interventions, and most particularly the Ebola vaccine that he led the development of while still at Merck. But Mark has broad experience not only in the pharmaceutical industry and at IAVI, but previously was at Emory University, so understands academic research, and early on was also at the NIH at the Office of AIDS Research. So really brings the public and private perspectives together, and delighted, Mark, to have you here. So everyone knows there are no slides. We know there's a heavy use of bandwidth right now, but really wanted to turn over to Mark to explore his thinking and some of the historic lessons from other vaccines that have been developed and what we might expect in the future for coronavirus.
Thanks very much, Mitchell. And I just want to echo your comments about the loss of Geeta. I mean, clearly, I think all of us who knew her, recognize what a great, personification of the kind of humanity, compassion, science, focus, and commitment to public health that the world needs so much these days, and was a friend and inspiration to many of us. And as Mitchell indicated, it is a profound reminder of the global impact of the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic and how it's going to touch so many people's lives around the world. And clearly the loss of a beloved member of our community makes that even more real. As Mitchell indicated, I've been asked to talk about how my experiences in HIV vaccine development and Ebola vaccine development might be useful in promoting a broader understanding of what will be necessary to expedite the development and availability of an affordable, efficacious vaccine against SARS-CoV, and how can we make that globally accessible in a way that has the desired impact to protect people all around the world, regardless of the country or the circumstance they're living in, to be protected against this awful disease. I have also been asked to address how new partnership models are needed to meet such an unprecedented challenge that we're facing now in trying to develop a vaccine against SARS-CoV-2 as quickly as possible. Clearly, I think there are valuable lessons from the past, but what we're facing now is truly unprecedented, and I'll talk a bit about that, and I'm sure that'll come up in questions that arise later in the discussion. My background in HIV, as Mitchell indicated, is fairly long-standing. I've been working on the virus, in terms of studying its pathogenesis and prevention for as long as we've actually known of HIV as an isolated virus. And I did play a role in the development of the Ebola vaccine while I was at Merck, as Mitchell indicated, and also in light of that, and I'll talk a little bit about this, played an important early role in efforts to work with multiple stakeholders to try to be better prepared for future outbreaks, and that gave rise to the formation of what's now known as the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, or CEPI. And when we're thinking about, what we've learned from the past and how we can build upon those lessons and do even better today. I know there are a number of questions that people have as we consider the global response to COVID-19. First, how do we do our best to ensure that SARS-CoV-2 infection does not become an endemic infection that plagues humanity for many years to come? Clearly, all of us recognize how that can happen, and HIV is certainly the most vivid and impactful example of an emerging zoonotic infection that gets a foothold in the human population, and you just have such a struggle to get rid of it. Secondly, what role can a vaccine play in controlling and potentially eradicating the COVID-19 pandemic? Thirdly, what are the prospects for developing a safe and efficacious vaccine, and when can we expect that one or more of them will be available? Given the complexity and urgency of this, the fourth point that I think many people are wondering about is how are different partners working together to accelerate vaccine development, and what are the opportunities for that process to be even more effective? And lastly, what more needs to be done to be successful in accelerating vaccine development efforts as quickly as possible? Given that this audience has a special expertise and interest in HIV prevention, I did want to highlight 4 specific ways that the response to SARS-CoV-2 vaccine development has been really enabled in tremendous ways by the decades of investment in HIV vaccine research. First off, the tool—
Your call has been placed on hold.
First off, the tools and insights emerging from HIV vaccine development are now being directly applied to develop a SARS-CoV-2 vaccine. And this is really sort of in multifaceted ways. One, the techniques of structure-based immune design that have been deployed to make an efficacious, or try to make an efficacious HIV vaccine are now being directly applied to SARS-CoV-2. Importantly, tools such as, the efforts that many of you have heard about developing monoclonal antibodies for therapy and prophylaxis of COVID-19. These tools were directly derived from the work on HIV broadly neutralizing antibodies. And additionally, important tools that are accelerating vaccine development, such as nucleic acid-based vaccines, such as RNA, DNA vaccines, and viral vectors, were really pioneered to a large extent in the pursuit of an HIV vaccine development. So in many ways, we are in a better position to approach COVID-19 vaccine development because of all the tremendous innovation and investment that's gone into HIV vaccine development. Secondly, and I think everyone on the call really appreciates this, is HIV certainly put equitable global access front and center in the discussions of any development of any biomedical innovation. Not only do we need to think about how to expedite the development of an efficacious vaccine, but we need to figure out right now how to make sure that it's available to everyone who needs it, regardless of their geographic or economic circumstances. Thirdly, I think the investment in strengthening local research capacity and efforts around community engagement that were put in place to support HIV research and development and treatment programs is now enabling many countries, including low-income countries, to have a stronger foundation to support the local response to COVID-19. And that not only includes, expediting the availability of testing for the virus, but also engagement in meaningful ways in vaccine and therapeutic research and development. And lastly, the point that I would make is that, one of the things we all know that HIV has done in the global response to it is it sort of gives you reason to believe that what was previously considered impossible is actually possible. I think many of us will remember when antiretroviral therapy was first developed, people thought that it would be impossible to make it available in resource-limited settings, and we all know that that was not true. And the emergence of really important partnerships and significant investment by governments in organizations like PEPFAR and the Global Fund, I think, set a meaningful precedent that puts us in a better position now. Reflecting back on, the lessons from Ebola, turning to that now, and as Mitchell indicated, I coordinated that program while at Merck from, the early days of the vaccine engagement effort through the time when an efficacy result was obtained in the study in Guinea. And that happened with an unprecedented pace, going from a first-in-human study to an efficacy result in approximately 10-month period of time. So that, certainly set the sort of speed record for development of a vaccine. And I want to just sort of emphasize that there are a couple of similarities between that experience as well as some differences. With respect to the similarities, it's clear, number one, that there's going to be a need for multi-sector partnerships, including among many organizations that may not have previously worked together and may have even had some degree of tension and hostility between them. And that's certainly what happened with Ebola. It brought together a number of organizations to work together very effectively who previously had not done so, and that was really critical for the success of that effort. These kind of multi-sector partnerships are very complicated to navigate, but they can be very effective, and there really isn't going to be any alternative if we're going to expedite the development of a COVID-19 vaccine. And I think we have some additional tools and opportunities here, but it's clear that we're going to need new ones as well. The second similarity is that it's far better to be proactive rather than reactive, and one of the impacts of the response to the 2014 to 2016 Ebola outbreak was really sort of changing how we think about preparedness to address emerging infectious disease threats, including what's been referred to as pathogen X, a sort of newly emerging viral infection, which the SARS-CoV-2 fits very well. And this was what stimulated the formation of the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, which is an amazingly important organization that includes, funding from, multiple, public sector entities, governments, and organizations like the Wellcome Trust and the Gates Foundation. CEPI is now directly involved in supporting vaccine development against SARS-CoV, and Helen Reese is currently the chair of the CEPI Scientific Advisory Board, so she may talk more about this later. That was a role that I had previously played in the early days of CEPI. What's very different, though, between Ebola vaccine development and SARS-CoV-2 vaccine development is, number one, the Merck vaccine, now known as Ervebo. It didn't start from scratch with the emergence of the 2014 to 2016 outbreak. That vaccine had been worked on for almost a decade preceding the 2014 outbreak, and there was a lot of preclinical data on that, including efficacy and some safety data in preclinical settings, and a vaccine had already been GMP manufactured and was able to enter the clinic almost immediately when that outbreak emerged. Secondly, the outbreak was largely geographically contained in West Africa, primarily in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea, which is very different from the current global reach of SARS-CoV-2. Thirdly, a smaller number of vaccine doses were needed to address that outbreak, and that could really be handled by one entity alone. In this case, one manufacturer would be sufficient to meet the global need. And the fourth one is that the outbreak was waning as vaccine development proceeded. So it was really a race to demonstrate vaccine efficacy against a decreasing incident infection rate. And while it's not clear what's going to happen with COVID-19, it's quite likely that the virus will still be widely circulating when vaccines are ready to enter efficacy evaluation. So as I conclude my comments, I just wanted to sort of make a couple of points that maybe will be helpful for the subsequent discussion. So first off, many people are hearing the statement that a vaccine will be available in 12 to 18 months. And I think it's really important for all of us to ask, what are people really meaning when they say that? Do they mean that we'll have efficacy data on one or more vaccine candidate, or that adequate global supply of an efficacious vaccine will be available and being actively implemented to stop the pandemic? This is especially important because unlike Ebola, where you might need a few 100,000 doses, we're going to need billions of doses of vaccine most likely, and this is a huge difference. And I think everyone is focusing attention on how fast initial vaccine candidates, including RNA vaccines, have gone from recognition of the pathogen to entering the clinic, including these novel nucleic acid technologies. But is it really the most important criteria about being fastest to the clinic or fastest to global access? What needs to be done? How are we going to scale things up? These are all very important. How are the vaccines going to be delivered to all at-risk populations or multiple immunizations needed? Do we have the requisite delivery tools? I think we're seeing this in the case of HIV testing, that it's not just the test kits, it's the supporting materials. And if we're talking about a vaccine that's administered intramuscularly, we'll need adequate numbers of needles, syringes, or specialized delivery devices in the case of some of the DNA vaccine. So when we're thinking about the development of a SARS-CoV-2 vaccine, I think it's important to note what is truly unprecedented about it. Number one, the urgency to develop it. Number two, that we're really starting from scratch with a newly emerging, previously unknown pathogen. Number three, I think we don't really know what the regulatory framework is going to be that expedites vaccine development while ensuring scientific rigor and volunteer safety, and what will be the framework for widespread introduction of a vaccine before formal regulatory approval might be available. Fourth, the magnitude of the need is really unprecedented. As I mentioned before, we'll likely need billions of doses, and there's no way that any one company or developer can meet this need by themselves, and clearly new partnership models are going to be needed to address that. And what's going to be really important, fifthly, is that governments and donors are going to need to make investments now at risk if we're going to be able to expedite actual impact. We simply cannot wait until we have efficacy data before we begin manufacturing scale up. And I think it's really important, lastly, that we focus on the need for equitable global distribution and how these decisions are going to be made, because it's quite likely that at least initially limited vaccine supply is going to be available. And how do we do this in a world where nationalism seems to be the predominant political force these days? So I think there's a key role for advocacy here. There's a key role for focus on equity and affordable access. And I know those are all things that many of you are intimately familiar with, and you have an important role to play here as well. So I'll stop here and be happy to entertain any questions you have later.
Fantastic. Mark, that was a superb overview of where we are and clearly where we need to go. I do want to let people know that your questions and comments coming in are fantastic, and they're being added to the queue. I know a number of people asked about slides. Neither Mark nor Helen have slides. A recording of this call will be made available, and undoubtedly we'll all together make some key fact sheets coming out of the terrific inputs that Mark just provided, but just wanted to let people know. But again, you can still use the Q&A feature and the chat feature on Zoom and email avac@avac.org. But before we open it up to questions and conversation, I want to turn to Helen Reese. And Helen, I know we had a little technical difficulty getting you on. I hope you're there. Let me first check to see if you're there, and then I'll actually introduce you.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, loudly and clearly, Helen. Thank you so much. And I think most people on this call will know Helen, and Mark just alluded to this, Helen is currently the chair of the Scientific Advisory Committee of CEPI that is driving forward a range of vaccine developments, and she can certainly speak to that. But as all of you will know, Helen wears many, many hats, and for a very long time served as the chair of the Scientific Advisory Group of Experts, SAGE, at WHO, looking at all vaccines, so has a lot of experience on the vaccine front. In addition, Helen is quite involved in emerging trials right now in South Africa around therapies, treatments for COVID-19, and so we have a chance to engage with that as well. So perhaps I'll turn it over to you, Helen, to provide some comments on both those fronts, CEPI and vaccines, as well as the treatment research, and then we'll open it up to a conversation.
Thank you very much. And I'll talk quite loudly because I'm not sure how clear I'll be. But good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit about CEPI, building on what Mark has said, and then perhaps then a little bit about the other trials and thinking that's going on. So CEPI was established after the Ebola outbreak in West Africa And the aim was to accelerate the development of vaccines against emerging infectious diseases, but also to enable equitable access for these vaccines for affected populations during outbreaks. So the focus is broadly preparedness, so that the CEPI has been thinking since its founding about what are the priority pathogens we need to think about, and interestingly, MERS-CoV was one of those pathogens that was identified, and starting to invest money already in those candidates. Response to accelerate the research so that in the event of an outbreak, you can move extremely quickly, and sustainability, so looking for durable solutions. And this really was because, as Mark said, there was a scramble in response to the Ebola outbreak with quite a number of candidate vaccines, but a lack of global coordination. We got one phase 3 trial, which has been extraordinarily important in Ebola vaccines. But one of the things that CEPI has always had on its agenda as a backdrop to this is what you heard Mark describe as disease X. So this is a disease that everyone has been fearing, likely to be the kind of disease we're now seeing that jumps from animals to humans, and most likely, as everyone had predicted, to be a respiratory disease that would spread extremely rapidly around the world because of air traffic and the movement of people, and to have a significant mortality. If you remember, we had pandemic flu some years ago, and we were equally worried, but the death rate associated with that was much lower than that we're currently seeing with COVID-19. So in January of this year, the Scientific Advisory Committee of CEPI actually met because this new virus had been identified. And I remember that call very clearly, because we were saying, do we ask the board of CEPI to release a lot of funding looking for candidate vaccines for this new virus? And we said at the time, this was before there was human-to-human transmission. So what we had seen at that time when we had that call was animal-to-human transmission. And the comment made, I remember it was, I think we should release this money and we should back candidate vaccine development now, because we, at the very least, we can regard this as a dry run for disease X, but at the worst, this is going to turn out to be disease X. And indeed, of course, it is the disease X that we've all feared. So there was, the way that CEPI works is that there's a call for proposals. People submit, and there were nearly 50 submissions. And then the Scientific Advisory Committee, together with external experts, evaluate and score very objectively the applications. So CEPI is supporting the development of 8 different vaccines, which have different what are called platforms and somewhat different antigens, although mostly the antigens for this virus are the same. And they're at somewhat different stages of development. But we didn't start anything that was too high up the development pipeline, too far away from getting into the clinic, as Mark said. So we looked at things that were looking promising, things that looked promising for the original SARS outbreak, for MERS, platforms that looked like we could rapidly adapt them for COVID-19. And as a result, there are currently 8 products that are in development. But there are many other parties also looking and supporting vaccines, and there are between 40 and 50 candidate vaccines worldwide now being looked at from places like NIH, but also in China as well. And China's vaccine development has grown in leaps and bounds in the last 10 years. So lots of vaccines. We've had the first clinical trial in humans, and we're pushing, as you heard, as fast as can be. I think with that number of vaccines and looking at the potential of these vaccines, and also looking at some of the early data around some vaccine candidates for MERS and SARS, I think that we will get vaccines. But if we have 40 to 50 candidates now, I think we all recognize that most of those are not going to pass even the first post. So if we can get 2, 3 vaccines from this, I think we would be thrilled. So that's the aim. And the other thing that, of course, is having to be looked at now is not only what the vaccine is, but also when choosing these candidates, how easy is this vaccine to manufacture? Are there manufacturing sites that are going to be easy to convert? How quick is it going to be to produce these millions and millions of doses that we're going to need? And who's going to invest that money at risk in manufacturing now? Because as we heard with the epidemiology of COVID-19, in countries we're seeing that not only the second wave, but I think we all anticipate that in many settings this might well become endemic or even seasonal. So this is going to be a nasty virus that we're going to have to deal with for some years to come, perhaps in a different context to the one that many of us are sitting in now. I'll stop there. Oh, no, I won't, because you wanted me to tell you briefly about the other trials that are going on worldwide. Mitchell, shall I continue?
Yeah, I think so. It'd be great, Helen.
Okay. So the other thing in response to COVID-19 was, and clearly China was trying to do this as it sort of came to terms so quickly with this outbreak, was what other things do we need? And clearly, very urgently, we needed effective therapies. We have therapies that would alleviate symptoms, say paracetamol for mild symptoms and things like this, oxygen for respiratory distress. But we have at the moment, we have no therapies that have been shown definitively to change the course of the disease. So we wanted therapies and we needed to find out if they worked. But just like HIV, we also want to find drug interventions that, while we're looking for a vaccine, will also protect risk populations. And in particular, at the moment, people are extremely worried about the health worker and the workforce. Because if we cannot keep them at work, the outcome for patients is going to be much, much worse. So in addition to the vaccine work, WHO gathered together some of the world's best experts to look at existing drugs and emerging drugs to say, can we repurpose existing drugs and can they be used for COVID-19? Is there any indication that these might be successful? And also, are there any drugs that are in the early stage of development? They exist, but they're in the early stage of development that might have utility in treating COVID-19 patients. And one of the things they looked at was, what did we learn from the MERS outbreak? Were there products there that we used, or the SARS outbreak? What were the products that showed potential? And from all of that, WHO identified 4 different products. And there's now a global study that's underway called Solidarity. About 60 to 70 countries have indicated interest in joining it, and about 10 countries so far are already implementing this protocol. And those include many European countries, but some countries from the Far East. And South Africa, in terms of the African region, is a country that's quite far advanced in doing all that's required to set up our hospitals to be able to participate in this trial. The other thing that's been looked at, and there are 2 big studies looking at this, are drugs for protecting particularly healthcare workers. And there are big studies that are exploring whether it's possible with again, existing drugs to either prevent infection or change the course of disease and prevent death. And also what would be the least dose of a drug that would be able to do that, because this is prevention. And as you know, with prevention, we want drugs that give few side effects and are easy to take. So I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Great. Helen, thank you so much. And both you and Mark providing terrific overviews and generating lots of fantastic questions. I'm going to try to bundle a bunch together and happy to have both of you respond as best we can, and we'll get as far as we can in this fantastic list. I think, both of you touched on the incredible urgency and of the dynamism with so many candidates in the vaccine pipeline already in such a short period of time. And you both talked about the coordination and particularly CEPI's role in that. But a number of questions came in about the selection of which candidates go forward. How does that get decided? Is that CEPI alone? And what are some of the basis for those decisions, given the issues you both raised in terms of the need for manufacturing? So what are the trade-offs? And so I guess very quickly then, how does that global coordination happen? What more needs to happen to make that so? And then related to that, a question specifically, I think, Mark, for you, you described really nicely the Ebola experience and partnerships coming together amongst groups that don't always work together or hadn't worked together in the past. And so a question there about how to manage those partnerships and even the competition amongst developers. So I wonder if you both might look a bit at that issue, those issues related to coordination and product selection and prioritization.
Would you like to start, Helen?
Sure. So you obviously have to have objective criteria when you're looking at applications. So some of the criteria were, first of all, how far advanced down the development pathway were the products. So if somebody had a brilliant idea, but it was still very, very far back in the laboratory, that's not really going well, that wasn't part of what was required at this point. Secondly, is the technology that's being used a licensed technology or is it novel technology? Now, both have a place. The advantage of licensed technologies is that they will have been proven to have worked for other vaccines. So platforms which have worked for other vaccines where you can, if you like, take an antigen and plonk it onto a platform which is already proven. But on the other hand, there might well be a place for novel vaccines, particularly because this is a novel virus. So we need to have a range of things so that we press the right button and find out what works. Thirdly, how quickly can you go? Because if people are saying, well, we think we can get this far in 2 years, that's not as good as if people say, we think we can get into the clinic earlier, we think we can do this by then. So speed was one of the other things. Manufacturing scalability, and Mark can talk more to this because he's the real expert, but some technologies for vaccines are much easier and some are much more difficult to manufacture. So if you choose something that's going to be extremely difficult to manufacture, or it takes a long time to manufacture, or it takes a lot of work to manufacture relatively small numbers of doses, that is also potentially going to be a disadvantage. Because as you say, at the end of this, we want to be able to churn out millions of vaccines. And then looking at all of this together, looking at who the applicant is, what their experience is, are they linked to manufacturers, have they done things before, putting it together in a composite way, what is the likelihood of success? Those are some of the considerations. Over.
Thanks, Helen. I think I would just second everything that Helen said. You know, with respect to the sort of bigger picture question that was asked about, you know, how this is all coordinated and how decisions are made in a sort of strategic way, and it's not a competition, but there's a kind of shared community response to this. You know, that is actually something that is, you know, being built as we, you know, speak. When we talked before about the importance of being, you know, prepared rather than responding, I think innovations like CEPI have been really important, but in some ways, this disease emerged before we actually had sort of a real global governance mechanism in place, and that I think we will unfortunately have to address. But I do think if one positive thing comes out of the COVID-19 response, it will be to clarify the importance of having proactively defined models of collaboration, evaluation, decision making and sort of willingness to make investments at risk so that one can go as quickly as possible. I wish I could say that there actually was a mechanism in place that would allow that kind of equitable access, shared decision making, prioritization, and everyone working together. That's not in place now. I think there are lots of goodwill and lots of people who want to make that happen, but I don't know that it's going to be easy, but the extent to which we can do that is going to be critical. And with respect to the partnership question, I mean, the way I often talk about things is there's this sort of science of innovation, which really drives the actual development of the vaccine, but there's the sort of science of partnerships, which is an area that needs additional attention because it is something that requires thoughtfulness and new strategies, and we need to study that better and get even better at that. And I hope that we'll be good enough to respond quickly to this pandemic, but I know that this pandemic will force us to become increasingly good at it for the future.
A beautiful point, Mark, about the science of partnership and needing to focus on that. I wonder, you both touched on a lot of looking forward and then the magnitude of need and some of these delivery challenges. And I wonder if you might both pick up on it. And I'm thinking particularly, and knowing both of you as I do, thinking about delivering a vaccine to adults is less well known to us than classic EPI vaccination programs. And I wonder if you might both think ahead to some of the challenges, but also what, if anything, should we be doing now as we see these vaccines in development to think anew about how to address some of those delivery challenges and what will undoubtedly be this huge magnitude of need.
Helen, would you like to?
Would you want to go first?
Okay.
I guess I should.
Okay.
Well, I mean, that's a really critically important question. And there too, I think we unfortunately are starting from scratch as people have a better understanding of this pandemic and its global reach and sort of the kind of issues that need attention immediately. And I think that there is an effort to try to stimulate that dialogue. I think it is not sufficiently well developed, and it needs much more focus and attention. I mean, I think in some ways, we will have to go back to earlier examples. I think everyone knows, the disease that was eradicated from human populations was smallpox, and that was eradicated through a focused strategy that involved delivery of a vaccine to large numbers of individuals around the world with targeted vaccination strategies where appropriate. But it also was made possible by a simple delivery tool, the bifurcated needle and a single dose administration and an inexpensive vaccine. And we may actually find some useful lessons in going back and reading that history, but we definitely need to put in place implementation programs now, just like we need to put in place, manufacturing programs now.
I wonder, Helen, I'm happy to have you come in. I just want to, on that manufacturing question, Mark, just because a number of people came into this, because you did, I think, help us all realize that this is a vaccine really inevitably for everybody. How do you manufacture to that?
Well, I mean, I think that's a very important question. So one issue to recognize is that there's limited vaccine manufacturing capacity globally, and it's very rare to actually have any excess capacity, and many vaccine manufacturing plants are dedicated to a specific vaccine, and they can't be readily adapted to produce another vaccine. And it's not like many vaccine developers are going to totally redirect their manufacturing to make a COVID vaccine. There are efforts to try to look at the global landscape of available vaccine manufacturing capacity. But going back to Helen's point, the different vaccines that are being developed often use different manufacturing strategies, and that's not really optimal. I think we need to sort of understand how can we have some harmonization so that at least classes of vaccines might have common manufacturing platforms, which would involve coordination and communication early in the development process. And I think there's awareness that that needs to happen, and CEPI and others are trying to address that issue, but it's really important that we make progress on it. But, you know, the need to produce billions of doses is something that is unprecedented in the time frame we're talking about, and I think that's going to require multiple vaccine manufacturers to work together to meet that global need and sort of build upon, you know, taking advantage of existing technologies for production rather than novel ones which might have problems with, you know, scaling up. So that effort really is under active exploration, but like so many other things, it needs to be taken to a much greater scale than it's currently taking place at. This is an unprecedented challenge. I believe that it can be solved, but it's going to require totally new partnerships, including partnerships between private sector companies that often may not you know, have the opportunity to collaborate or are precluded by things like antitrust mechanisms from collaborating in this way. A lot of that has to go out the window, and new models need to be developed.
And sorry, Helen, I cut you off, but about all of this too, please feel free.
Yeah, no, well, I'll start off with the issue about the need for vaccine manufacturers. And just to say that one of the things that, in a way, I mean, you know, the global world order, as we all know, is going to be reshaped. Now, developing country manufacturers have really come into their own in recent years. And we've seen, for example, India has become a powerhouse of vaccine manufacture. And China is also really growing in its ability. And there are other countries, particularly in the Far East, but other countries who are aspirational. So Egypt, South Africa, etc. The second thing is that there was a meeting of health ministers about, I guess, 2-3 years ago now in Addis, and these were all of the African Union health ministers and finance ministers, and they came out with an Addis declaration around vaccines, and they all said, we want to be able to produce our own vaccines in the African region. So I think that's not going to solve the problem now for quick manufacture, and we're going to have to look at really well-established manufacturers who can scale up. And we probably will see, you know, not only groups like the Indian manufacturers, but also China, I suspect, will come to the fore in this. But in the future, in the medium to longer term, I think that this is an opportunity for developing country manufacturers. But I just wanted to come back to your question about how do you give a vaccine to adults. So just two thoughts on this. It's a very good question, because where have we massively failed in giving vaccines to adults? Seasonal flu. We always have to beg people until now, until COVID, to have a seasonal flu jab. Now, of course, with winter coming in the Southern Hemisphere, people are dying to get their seasonal flu jabs because they recognize that comorbidities with two viruses, which occurred in China not infrequently, would be very bad news. But people don't take up seasonal flu. You're quite right, and you can beg and plead, and people don't, not even people who are at risk. On the other hand, we have the experience in the African region of a vaccine that was developed specifically for what's called the Meningitis Belt, which is a belt across sort of central mid-African countries. And there, for meningitis A, which was a major killer and came in outbreaks almost every year, a vaccine with WHO support called AVAC was developed. And it was for people, they were giving it to people up to 30 years of age. And the queues went round the block for that because people were so scared of meningitis. So I think if we were to have today a vaccine, the queues would be so long. I mean, people would march with their feet. They would want everyone in their families, children, the elderly, vaccinated. But at the point, assuming we get a vaccine, and I'm fairly confident that we will, we're also going to say, are we going to have to then give it to the first priority people? Who would they be? Well, at the moment, as I said, it would be healthcare workers, but it would also be those people that we've seen are most vulnerable to this infection, which includes large time the elderly. That begs another question about the elderly immune system. Will a vaccine that works well in a 20-year-old work well in a much older person? Because their immune system, just like other bits of the body, has sort of gone in, it's not as strong as it used to be. So if you give a vaccine, it's not going to respond in the same way. So there are many questions once we get a vaccine about who we give it to, given that we will have limited supplies. Over.
Helen, that raises so many important issues of obviously ethics and equity, and that both of you have touched on. So just, and also the issue of the trial design itself. Just thinking about how these trials will be done, and then how one knows both for older people and for younger people whether they will work. All terrific. Obviously, just to flag, and I'm sure many of you are also aware that we're getting near the top of the hour. We're not going to get to every question, but we will be following up with Mark and Helen, and obviously there are many more conversations to be had. I do want to ask one very specific question that came in for you, Helen, because I think a lot of people were curious about the Solidarity trial and what the 4 arms of that trial are. And I know that's available online, but I think it might be helpful for this group to hear what those 4 arms are, but also a question both for that trial, but also I think for all of this work, both for treatment and for vaccines, one that I know both you and Mark think a lot about in our own collaborations, and that is how does community engagement happen? How can it happen? How should it happen in a pandemic situation? Keeping communities involved in the research itself, and obviously then we get to the access issue. So I wonder, Helen, if you want to quickly talk about the 4 arms and how engagement's happening, and then maybe both of you think a bit about how we might rethink or re-energize engagement around this.
So thank you. There are 4 arms which have an additional product, but there are 5 arms in the study altogether. The first arm is standard of care, which is defined, as I said, there are already more than 10 countries participating, and soon there'll be many more. So the standard of care is determined by the country, and it's for people who have been admitted to hospital. So, which means that they must be at least moderately ill, because obviously people with mild illness will remain in communities. So standard of care is the first arm, and standard of care applies to all of the 5 arms. The drugs that are being looked at are lamivudine-ritonavir, then lamivudine-ritonavir with interferon beta, and then remdesivir and chloroquine or hydrochloroquine. So those are the arms that are being looked at. And as I say, WHO has an expert panel, really the world's experts on all of these things, looking at what we know about the virus and what we're seeing all the time, because people are obviously trying out new therapies on a small scale all the time and reporting things. So there's continuous review of data, and are there extra products we should be adding? And the trial is designed that you can add extra arms with new products. But also in the event that when the sufficient patients are enrolled, if any of these products are shown not to be effective, then they'll be dropped from the study. Do you want that from the point of view of community? And I know we're coming quickly to the end. I think that we have learned, a lot of people are saying this, the lessons from HIV that we're able now to take into our response to COVID-19 are extraordinary. Community is one of them. Communication is another. Avoiding stigma is another. Partnership in trials, especially when we get to big vaccine trials, will be another. Information sharing and the accuracy of information. Not allowing people with counterfeit or rubbish cures to allow to be marketing that and exploiting people. And it's cures and test kits and just about everything else. And today I heard that in one of our townships in South Africa, somebody is administering a vaccine from a major grocery store. So these are the kinds of things where the community is absolutely critical. And we've learned so much from HIV, and I think we're already seeing that we're able to transfer this into our response to COVID-19 in the countries that have had the HIV experience. Over.
No, like as always, I completely agree with Helen. I would, just want to reflect it. Additionally, when we're talking about community here, we're really talking about everyone. We're talking about everyone on the phone. We're talking about all of our families. We're talking about all the people in the countries we live. We're talking about people at risk. We're talking about infected people. We're talking about responders. It's really, I think, going to be very evident where leadership comes from in this response. And while we all hope that governments will take a strong, decisive leadership role, I think it's quite likely, as we're already seeing, that the most effective response is going to be from the ground up, and that really involves, people at risk or affected who are stepping forward to try to solve this threat.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I will just say, from an AVAC perspective, both we've had the great pleasure of working with both IAVI and Mark and the Wits Reproductive Health and HIV Institute with Helen, and with many of you on the line, and with UNAIDS and the Good Participatory Practice Guidelines, which have been created in HIV, adapted for TB vaccine and drug development, and for emerging pathogen research, and clearly a need to collaborate together on that for this. Obviously, many additional questions. There was a question, I think, actually very importantly, for a lot of us who work in HIV vaccine advocacy and science that is related, that would love to have you both talk about. And that is, we spend a lot of our time in HIV talking about HIV subtypes, about the potential for mutations. We've obviously seen past vaccine candidates in HIV potentially modify or even accentuate risk. How does that all get considered in thinking through the range of COVID-19 vaccine candidates? Are those real issues, and how do those get addressed?
Well, it's an important consideration always when one is developing a vaccine. Fortunately, in this case, the replication mechanisms of coronaviruses are more accurate than those of HIV. So genetic variation in the virus is less pronounced and develops less readily. So while we don't yet know for sure all the data about, genetic diversity of the SARS-CoV-2 virus circulating around the world do suggest that, one vaccine, should be able to protect against many, viral variants. And we certainly hope that that's the case. We'll have to keep close attention to that issue under any circumstances.
Great. And maybe also before we end, and for both of you, especially given the CEPI experience, we see emergency responses, and then sometimes they wane quite a lot, but they wane more sometimes than even a vaccine response. So, we don't, we see developments earlier on around a MERS vaccine, and then we get past that and it disappears, and vaccine development wanes in that area. We're in obviously a very different time and place with COVID-19, but I'd love to hear you both reflect on what we need to be thinking about in the future. So whether this is addressed as a one-off, whether this does become a seasonal issue, thoughts from both of you on how we build for the future so we don't end up in a situation again where pathogen X appears. And I know you both touched on it, but just thought it might be helpful to have you both opine on that before we close.
I think the whole idea behind CEPI, but I think, CEPI is one organization. As I say, there are many other investments going on, but the whole idea was to think about these pathogens that are a threat, that are emerging infectious diseases, and that have the threat of epidemics and outbreaks. So if you look at the kinds of pathogens that CEPI has selected as priorities prior to this, it's Lassa, MERS-CoV, Nipah, Rift Valley fever, chikungunya, Ebola, and these are all vaccines that really won't have a commercial market. So I think if we've learned anything, the importance here is that we ignore things that don't have a commercial market at our risk, because it'll come back and bite us. And that's why it's starting to tackle these things that might be quite regional, might be quite seasonal, might wax and wane, but cause enormous damage in terms of people's health, mortality, and economies. We can't go away from this, because we've already said this is too important. How many times have we said it now? This is the fourth time in a very short number of years. MERS, SARS, Ebola, and now this. Very few years, and these infectious diseases are causing massive instability, either regionally or globally. So these are lessons I think that the world will have to hang on to.
Yeah, no, and I agree with all of that. I think one thing about this is different is that this isn't an abstract notion. It's affecting everyone's life in ways that are much more concrete and close by than maybe Ebola was, or SARS or MERS, which seemed far away and abstract. This is affecting people in concrete ways. And if something good comes out of this, I hope it'll mean that we really get our act together globally, nationally, and locally to be better prepared to respond to future risks like this. Because one thing is certain is that this kind of circumstance will repeat itself again and again unless we have a better way of preparing and responding.
Mark and Helen, both, I think you've captured it. There's an urgency, a pandemic response, and yet what you both have said multiple times in the hour is the need to do that response while also building something far more sustainable, far more equitable, and far more comprehensive than we have ever been able to do. And let us hope that all of that actually it gets done rather than just talked about. There's obviously an enormous amount of work to do, many questions that didn't get answered. Obviously, Mark and Helen and others on this line will, all of us evolving to deal with coronavirus. I think maybe I'll just let you each have a last word, because you also continue to be in your day jobs leaders in the HIV response and the HIV research response. And I wonder if there's any last thoughts either of you want to kind of put in for how do we manage pandemically in 4 months while dealing with the 40-year-old pandemic that really brings many people on this line together over many years.
Well, last word I would say is that if ever there had been something that's humbled us all, this particular pandemic is it, because it respects nobody. And this is therefore a leveler. We speak so much about universal health coverage, about the SDGs, and about equity. This is going to be something that we're going to have to really look at. As Mark said at the beginning, we must watch this issue around access. If people close borders and say mine first and mine second and mine last, and we don't mind about what happens elsewhere, then the world has lost an opportunity to do things fundamentally different in terms of global health and really actually adopting the principles of the Sustainable Development Goals.
Yeah, no, definitely. I would just add, clearly we all know that our efforts in HIV have been disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic, and that means that there's lost time and lost opportunity, and unfortunately people are going to suffer as a result, and timelines are going to be delayed, and we collectively need to figure out how to maintain the priority of the HIV response throughout the COVID pandemic. I do hope, again, being an optimist, that what we learned from the COVID response may also be helpful in the future of the HIV response, just like the HIV response put us in a much better place to address COVID-19.
Beautifully said, Mark and Helen. And at the end of the day, I think what I hear loudly and clearly is it's about global health. It is not about any one disease over another, and it's not about, as you said, Mark, early, and Helen too, this is not about nationalism. This is global. And if we ever needed to be global health activists and advocates and global health scientists and researchers and global health funders, now is that time. I can't think of two better colleagues, friends, and mentors to have than Helen and Mark. We have terrific opportunities, terrific challenges, and importantly, I think to make good on what Mark said is to give new meaning to the science and the art of partnership to really move all of this work forward. Really, I want to thank everybody. I know lots of questions unanswered, some requests for additional follow-up information. It will all be posted on the website with this recording, as well as the recording from last week, the webinar with a number of other colleagues looking at this on the AVAC website. It's avac.org/COVID, hopefully super simple for all of these resources. If we'll be doing additional webinars as needed. If you have information needs, thirsts, and hungers, or things you want to offer, please let us know at avac@avac.org, and we will do our best. And we will undoubtedly be back with Mark and Helen, IAVI, Wits RHI, and many, many others to think about vaccines, therapeutics for COVID, as well as in the HIV space and the larger global health space. So Mark and Helen, thank you all so much. Stay safe and well, all of you on the line, and we look forward to continued work together.
Thanks, Mitchell. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Stay safe.
Cheers all.